There are things hidden inside Bloodborne that most players never encounter, not because they are rare by accident, but because the game seems almost deliberately designed to keep them out of reach. And this video is a full breakdown of the strangest, most overlooked anomalies in the entire game. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because the first one blew up in a way I genuinely did not expect. People kept asking for a second part, and honestly, I had more material sitting in my notes than I could fit into one video anyway, so here we are. When I was assembling this one, I made a deliberate choice to focus less on the big-name mysteries that everyone has already talked to death, and more on the smaller, weirder stuff that tends to get ignored. Things that suggest something about the game's development, or about the lore, that you would only notice if you spent a completely unreasonable amount of time staring at corners that most players sprint past. A lot of what I found points toward a version of Bloodborne that was either planned and cut, or intended and left deliberately vague. I leaned into that ambiguity. I am not going to tell you I have definitive answers. What I am going to do is show you what is there, and let you draw your own conclusions. Chapter 1. The Beasts That Should Not Exist. The first thing worth understanding about Bloodborne's bestiary is that it was not designed as a clean taxonomy. From Software did not sit down and say, here are the beasts, here are the kin, here is where one ends and the other begins. The categories bleed into each other in ways that the game's item descriptions hint at, but never fully explain. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the handful of enemy types that seem to fall outside any reasonable classification. Start with the Loran Silver Beast. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward beast-type enemy. Fast, aggressive, punishing if you let it corner you. But look at its behavior more carefully, and something does not add up. It moves with a precision that most beasts lack. It does not thrash or flail. It tracks you. It repositions. The way it paces before committing to an attack is closer to the behavior of the kin enemies than anything you would call a beast in the traditional sense of the word. The item descriptions associated with Loran suggest a place that was consumed by fire so completely that almost nothing survived. And yet the silver beasts are there, intact, organized, and functional in a way that the other Loran inhabitants are not. One possible reading of this is that the silver beasts were not caught in whatever destroyed Loran. They may have arrived afterward, or they may have been the cause of it. There is a variant that appears in the Chalice dungeons with a slightly different moveset that has never been given a distinct name in any of the game's files. At least, none that have been publicly documented. It uses an electrical attack that shares visual properties with the Tonitrus weapon, which is a player-usable item explicitly described as mimicking the power of the arcane. The connection between beast behavior and arcane mimicry is one of the game's most interesting loose threads. The Murgo's attendants are another category that does not sit cleanly anywhere. They are described as phantoms, which is the game's way of nodding at their incorporeal nature, but they have physical collision. They can be hit with physical attacks, and they bleed. Phantoms, in the traditional Bloodborne sense of the word, are things like the choir servants in the Nightmare of Mensis. Murgo's attendants are something else. They wear the vestments of the healing church, but they move like insects. What makes them anomalous is not just their design, it is their placement. They only appear in the Nightmare, specifically the sections surrounding the Wet Nurse and Murgo. They do not appear anywhere else in the game, and they do not appear in any Chalice dungeon. The game treats them as if they are indigenous to that specific location, which suggests that they are not beasts or kin in any conventional sense, but something that was generated by or for that space. The Wet Nurse herself is one of the most visually distinct bosses in the game, and yet the game tells you almost nothing about her. Her item drops are minimal. She has no associated lore entry. She does not speak. She does not react to the player until the player is directly in front of her. The implication in most lore analysis is that she is something ancient, predating the current nightmare, potentially predating Murgo herself. But what makes her an anomaly in the context of this chapter is the question of what she is guarding versus what she is doing. She is positioned as Murgo's caretaker, but Murgo, as far as the game suggests, is already dead. The Great One's cord, the item you collect after defeating her, describes Murgo as a child of the Great Ones, who has already passed on. So the wet nurse is tending to something that no longer exists, or exists only as a residual cry that has not yet faded. That is a profoundly strange kind of function. It points toward a class of entity that does not behave based on present circumstances, but based on a role it was assigned and has never been released from. The brain of Mensis is technically classified as a kin enemy, but it is one of the only kin in the game that is completely stationary. Every other kin type moves, approaches, retreats, reacts. The brain does none of those things. It sits in the pit beneath the nightmare of Mensis and extends its gaze over everything above it. The mechanic associated with it, the frenzy build-up it inflicts at range, is unlike any other enemy ability in the game in terms of its implications. It is not attacking you. It is simply looking at you. The lamp mechanic that lets you lower the brain into the pit, and the item you collect from it after, suggests that the brain is a source of insight that has been deliberately suppressed by the school of Mensis. They found something they could not control, and they put it somewhere out of sight. The fact that you can use it before disposing of it, that you can deliberately trigger the frenzy to gain insight, is one of those small design details that points toward a larger argument the game is quietly making about the cost of knowledge. The Shadows of Yharnam are an anomaly of a different kind. They appear as a trio boss, which is already unusual in a game where most bosses are singular. But what makes them strange is the variety within that trio. One wields a katana and a torch. One wields twin blades. One uses snakes. The snake one does not fit with the other two, aesthetically or mechanically, and the item descriptions associated with them do not fully explain why a beast-adjacent entity would be using snake-based attacks unless the snakes are understood as a separate entity hitching a ride. There is a theory supported loosely by the Canehurst law that the snake motif in Bloodborne is connected to old blood cults that predate the Healing Church. The fact that one of the shadows has internalized that motif so completely that serpents literally emerge from its body points toward either a very advanced stage of transformation or a very different origin point from the other two. One possible reading is that the shadows are not three versions of the same thing, but three different things that are being bound together by ritual. The church giants are another case worth examining. They are humanoid, large, and slow in a way that suggests they were either bred for labor or modified for it. The fact that they appear primarily inside Healing Church locations, in the Cathedral Ward, and in the Research Hall, suggests an institutional function. But what is strange about them is the blindfold. Every church giant you encounter has had its eyes covered, not naturally, deliberately. The bandages are wrapped. Someone decided these things should not be able to see. One interpretation is that this is a practical measure, that a creature this powerful and this indifferent to pain would be harder to control if it could track targets visually. But another reading is that the blindfold is protective, not restraining, that the church giants were covered because whatever they might see in those spaces would be dangerous, not to the observers, but to the giants themselves. Given that insight and exposure to the arcane consistently damage the minds of the beings in this world, that second reading has some support. The carrion crows in the early game seemed trivial, just oversized birds that peck at you near the beginning of Old Yharnam and in the sewers. But there is something off about them that players tend to notice without articulating. They do not flee. Every other small enemy in the game has some kind of retreat behavior. The rats run when threatened. The small beasts scatter after a hit. The crows do not. They escalate, hit one, and the rest of the group becomes more aggressive, not less. That is a collective behavior that suggests either pack intelligence or some kind of communication, neither of which the game explains. The fluorescent flowers in the Nightmare Frontier and the Forbidden Woods are one of the most quietly unsettling designs in the entire game. They do not look like enemies. They look like plants. And then they attack. But what makes them anomalous is not the ambush mechanic, it is the noise they make. The sound design team gave them a vocalization that sits in a frequency range that most players describe as distinctly uncomfortable, not frightening in a jump scare way, but wrong in a way that is harder to name. That sound does not appear anywhere else in the game. The man-eater boars in the sewers are enemies that seem to have been placed purely for environmental storytelling. They are too big to have gotten into the tunnels they occupy through any obvious route. The tunnels themselves are not large enough to have contained them as they grew to that size. Either they were introduced when smaller, or they were introduced through a point of entry that no longer exists. The game does not address this. It is the kind of detail that suggests a world that existed before the player arrived and will continue to exist in whatever form after the player leaves. Winter lanterns, the pumpkin-head enemies in the nightmare sections, are classified as Great One phantoms in most analyses, and they share the frenzy-inducing gaze of the brain of Mensis. But their design, the split torso, the exposed brain, the hands reaching from the mouth cavity, combines elements from multiple places in the lore in a way that does not suggest a single origin. The doll faces on the bodies of winter lanterns are similar enough to the plain doll to raise questions that the game pointedly refuses to answer. The celestial children found near Fishing Hamlet are the final enemy worth cataloguing in this chapter. They move slowly, they do not attack them, they will simply walk into the water and disappear. That disappearing act is unique in the entire game. No other enemy type voluntarily exits the play space. The implication is that the sea in the hamlet connects to somewhere else, somewhere the celestial children are trying to return to. What that place might be, and whether it is the same place the Orphan of Kos came from, is one of the more genuinely compelling open questions in the whole game. The merciless watchers in the Chalice dungeons appear in 3 distinct variants, one with a club, one with a pistol, and one with a lamp. The lamp variant is the one that breaks the pattern. A watcher carrying a lamp does not fit functionally with the other 2. They are combat roles. The lamp is a navigational or ceremonial tool. Whether the lamp watchers are a different rank, a different function, or simply a remnant of an earlier design intention is something the game never addresses. The Labyrinth Sage is a Chalice dungeon exclusive that summons snatchers. The snatcher by itself is already an anomaly, because it is one of the only enemies in the surface game that captures the player, rather than killing them. The Sage redirecting those enemies as a controlled force suggests a hierarchy within snatcher behavior that is never explained anywhere in the surface game. The Sumerian queens across the Chalice dungeons show variation in their attacks and behaviors that point toward different lineages or different stages of transformation. The final Pthumerian queen, Yharnam, is visually and behaviorally distinct from the dungeon queens in ways that suggest she is not a descendant of the Chalice queens, but potentially their origin. One possible reading of the Pthumerian hierarchy is that the Chalice versions are later, degraded copies of something Yharnam represents in its original form. The cramped cassette enemies, more formally known as the Nightmare Apostles, who appear in the Nightmare of Mensis, present a different kind of anomaly. They are spider-like, they move on the ceiling, and they are extremely difficult to see in the dark sections of the nightmare. But the behavior that makes them strange is their reaction to the player parrying one of their attacks. Unlike almost every other enemy that can be parried, the Nightmare Apostles do not enter the staggered state after a parry. They continue attacking. The parry sound fires, the parry visual fires, but the enemy does not respond to it in the expected way. Whether this was designed or as a bug is something no official documentation has clarified. The cramped cassette enemy design shares visual elements with the spider enemies at Byrgenwerth, which connects them to Rom's lineage, but they are found in the Nightmare of Mensis rather than in Byrgenwerth's sphere of influence. What a Rom-adjacent creature is doing in a Mensis-controlled nightmare is a question the game does not answer. One reading is that the transformations associated with Byrgenwerth's research spread further than the school itself, and that the Mensis scholars may have had more contact with the Byrgenwerth methodology than their separate institutional identity suggests. The cane beasts in the areas near Canehurst, specifically the large werewolf-type enemies encountered on the road to the castle, have an aggressive range that exceeds their visible aggro radius by a significant margin. In Bloodborne, the aggro system generally gives the player fair warning through the enemy's posture change before they commit to an attack. The Canehurst Road beasts do not do this. They are stationary, and then they are attacking, with no visible intermediate state. Whether this is a design choice to make the approach to Canehurst tense, or an inconsistency in the enemy AI setup is unclear. The abhorrent beast, whether the one at the end of Jura's Covenant Consequences, or the ones found in the deepest Chalice dungeons, has an electricity-based attack suite that puts it in an unusual category. Lightning and electricity in Bloodborne are associated with the arcane, but specifically with bolt-type damage, which is distinct from the arcane damage type. The abhorrent beast is a beast, not akin. Beasts do not use arcane abilities. The abhorrent beast, using electrical attacks, is a violation of the game's own internal logic, one that is never addressed by the lore. The fluorescent flower's status, as both an environmental decoration and an enemy, is a distinction the game blurs more completely than almost anything else. Before you are in range for them to aggro, they are indistinguishable from non-interactive background flora. After they aggro, they behave as enemies, but the crucial detail is that they can be killed before they aggro. And when you kill an unaggroed fluorescent flower, the game plays the normal enemy death sound, but does not register the kill in a way that affects respawn timing. They come back faster when killed in their passive state than when killed after they have attacked. That behavioral asymmetry has no obvious design rationale. The plague-patient enemies in the early areas of the game have two states, docile and aggressive. In their docile state, they shamble, moan, and interact with the environment in ways that suggest confusion rather than malice. In their aggressive state, they are fast, focused, and surprisingly capable. The transition between the two states is triggered by noise or visual contact with the player, but there are specific plague patients in specific locations, most notably the group near the central Yharnam aqueduct, who remain in the docile state regardless of the noise level around them. You can fight other enemies next to them, and they will not aggro. The game has no explanation for why specific individuals from this enemy type have this property. The Cleric Beast, the game's first boss, has an alternate audio bark that plays during the fight if you arrive at the boss without triggering any other Cleric Beast audio during the approach. Most players who encounter the Cleric Beast have already triggered the roar that plays during the opening cutscene of Central Yharnam. Players who skip that area or who silence the approach through specific routing hear a different bark when the boss first detects them. The two barks are substantially different in tone, and the one that plays when you have not previously heard the Cleric Beast creates a different first encounter experience in a way that seems deliberate but is documented in very few speedrun or challenge guides. The Father Gascoigne fight, the game's second boss, includes an element that most players discover by accident or not at all. The music box item, if used during the fight, causes Gascoigne to falter for a moment and then speak. What he says is a name. The name is relevant to the quest line involving his daughters and to the overall story of what happened in Central Yharnam on the night the hunt began. But the interaction is so specific, requiring possession of an item that most players do not have at that point in the game, that a significant portion of the player base never sees it. For a moment that seems to be part of the intended narrative experience of the fight, it is buried in a way that suggests the development team expected players to follow a more linear path than they typically do. The shadow enemies in Yahar'gul have a variation that appears only in the nighttime version of the area, after the blood moon has risen. This variation has slightly faster attack speed and a different color palette, with the darkness of their robes shifted toward a deeper value. The item drops from this variant are identical to the daytime variant. The design change, which is substantial enough that the enemies look like a different asset, has no lore or mechanical differentiation attached to it. It is visual design for its own sake, or it is visual design whose associated lore content was removed before the game shipped. The dogs found in the Chalice dungeons, specifically the fire-breathing ones in the Pthumerian branch, have a heat effect applied to their body that the surface game's fire-adjacent enemies do not use. The surface game has brazier enemies and fire-wielding humans, but none of them have a persistent heat visual on their bodies the way the dungeon dogs do. The dungeon dogs look as though they are running at a temperature above normal biological ranges, not on fire, but generating heat continuously. Whether this was a dungeon-specific visual upgrade or a feature that was planned for surface enemies and not implemented is something the game provides no context for. The wandering nightmares, the small blob-like enemies that drop cold blood when killed, have a pathfinding behavior in the Chalice dungeons that differs from their behavior in the surface nightmare areas. In the nightmare areas, they move randomly, drifting through the space without apparent direction. In the Chalice dungeons, their movement has a directional component. They consistently move towards specific points in the room, regardless of player position, almost as if they are following a route. The end points of those routes are typically corners of rooms with no items, no architectural features, nothing that would explain the destination. They are going somewhere that no longer has anything there. The large pigs in the Cathedral Ward sewers are enemies that regenerate health if left alone for an extended period. That regeneration behavior is shared with only a few other enemies in the game, most of them in the DLC or in Chalice dungeons. The pigs in the sewers are the earliest instance of this mechanic in the game's critical path, and the mechanic is not explained or foreshadowed in any way. Players who fight one pig break off to heal and return find it partially restored, which can create an encounter significantly harder than intended, especially for first-time players. Whether the regeneration was placed there as a teachable moment for that mechanic, or as a hazard that the design team felt was appropriate for that point, in the difficulty curve is not something the game acknowledges. The Bloodlicker enemy, found in the research hall and in the Hunter's Nightmare, has a special interaction with the pools of blood that appear throughout the DLC environments. It is drawn to those pools and will feed from them if not engaged, which restores its health. The Bloodlicker feeding from ambient blood pools is one of the most direct statements the game makes about the nature of blood in this world, that it is a resource that even the game's minor enemies will actively seek out. The behavior also makes Bloodlicker encounters dynamic, in a way that most encounter design in Bloodborne is not, since the state of the environment affects the enemy's capabilities. The Hemwick Grave Women carry a specific item in some playthroughs that is not present in others, connected to the phase of the blood moon at the time of their death. This is a mechanic that players have documented in community forums, but that has not been replicated consistently enough to be considered fully verified. If it is real, it represents a version of Bloodborne's world that is slightly more reactive to narrative state than the game's general design suggests, with minor enemy drops changing based on where the player is in the main story. That kind of systemic responsiveness to story state would be a significant design detail, but it is one the game does not announce. The fishmen in the fishing hamlet have a specific death animation that involves them pulling themselves toward the nearest body of water before collapsing. The animation plays out fully, even when no water is in the immediate vicinity of where they die. In those cases, they are pulling themselves toward where the nearest water would be based on the area's geography, even if walls or terrain are in the way. That death behavior, the persistence of the impulse even in impossible circumstances, is either a very specific piece of behavioral design or an animation state that was set up to play regardless of environmental context. Either way, it communicates something about what the fishmen are and where their instincts are oriented. Chapter 2: The Broken Architecture of Yharnam. The city of Yharnam was built in layers, and the game lets you fall through most of them if you go looking in the right directions. The architecture of Yharnam is not just set dressing, it is a timeline. The older the structure, the deeper it goes, and the deeper you go, the more the design language shifts from Gothic stone and ironwork into something that does not have a clean cultural reference point. The Upper Cathedral Ward is built in a style that clearly references European ecclesiastical architecture. High arches, carved stone, stained glass, iron fences. It communicates wealth, institution, and a certain kind of organized religious power. But the lower sections of the Cathedral Ward, the tunnels and basements that connect to the Healing Church workshop, tell a different story. The construction technique changes. The stone is rougher, the proportions are wrong for human use, the passages are too tall and too narrow in ways that serve no obvious architectural function. This shift in construction style is one of the clearest indicators that the healing church built on top of something older, and that the something older was not built by humans. The game's lore supports this through the description of the choir, who are said to have reached the cosmos through a hole in the ceiling of the healing church workshop. A hole, not a door, not a window, not a designated passage. A structural breach that was then used as an access point. That is a very specific kind of improvisation, and it suggests that the people who found that access were not the ones who created it. The Forbidden Woods are an area that players tend to rush through because of how unpleasant the enemies are, but the environmental storytelling in the woods is some of the densest in the game. The abandoned village halfway through the area is structured like a normal settlement from the outside, with intact buildings, paths between structures, and evidence of daily life. But almost everything in it has been modified. The windows boarded, the doors reinforced from the inside, and the modifications were clearly made by people who were trying to keep something out. The snake clusters in the Forbidden Woods are one of the game's most unpleasant enemy types, but also one of the most interesting from a lore standpoint. The combination of multiple snakes operating as a single organism, with a human body at the core, suggests either a parasite relationship or a transformation that has overwritten the host almost entirely. The snake motif, as noted in the previous chapter, connects to pre-church blood cults, and the Forbidden Woods sit geographically in a position that would make them one of the older settled areas near Yharnam. The lecture building is the most architecturally anomalous location in the game. Full stop. It appears between two nightmare sections, with no obvious physical connection to the waking world. You access it from a door in the nightmare frontier, and you exit from a window into the nightmare of Mensis. That structure, a physical building floating between two nightmare spaces, is never explained. The game gives you enough context to understand that the lecture building is a School of Mensis location, but the question of how a building ends up in the space between nightmares is not answered. One possible reading is that the lecture building was deliberately constructed there, or constructed in the waking world, and then transposed into that liminal space through some application of the arcane. The notes left by students in the building suggest it was functional as an educational institution at some point, which implies that people moved through it regularly, which implies they had a way in and out that no longer exists, or is no longer accessible to the player. The nightmare of Mensis itself is structured like a real place, but with elements that are clearly wrong. The village at the beginning of the nightmare is populated with shadows of Yharnam and pig enemies that do not appear together anywhere else in the game. The river of blood running through the village is wide enough that it cannot be a natural formation. The scale of it, the deliberate channel, suggests an infrastructure of blood collection that has been running for a very long time. The nightmare frontier is harder to read architecturally because it is so degraded. The stonework that is visible is Pthumerian in style, which places it as old in Bloodborne's timeline. But the presence of amygdala suggests that the frontier is also a place where the boundary between the waking world and something beyond it is thin. The pits in the nightmare frontier that lead to poison swamps are a detail that does not serve any obvious narrative function, but the sheer depth of them suggests excavation. Someone dug those pits intentionally, for a purpose the current state of the area does not reveal. Byrgenwerth is an area that most players reach relatively late in the game's critical path, and it is significantly smaller than its narrative importance would suggest. The building itself is a manor house, not a university, which points toward an earlier period when the Byrgenwerth scholars were a private group rather than an institution. The lake behind it, with the Lunarium and the Moonside Lake, is one of the most important geographical points in the game's lore. The boundary between the lake's surface and the cosmos is described as thin in exactly the way that suggests it was deliberately thinned. The presence of the spider enemies in Byrgenwerth is one of the harder things to explain. The Great One Rom is a spider. The enemies guarding Byrgenwerth are also spiders, but the scholar enemies who walk the halls are in a transition state between human and spider. The sequencing of that progression from human student to hybrid creature to whatever Rom represents implies an experimental program that was running in Bergenworth, and that ROM is the successful endpoint of. But successful, by whose measure, is a question the game raises without fully answering. The Canehurst Castle is architecturally separate from everything else in the game, in a way that is not just aesthetic. It is elevated above the landscape, accessible only by a stagecoach that no longer operates through natural means. The castle was cut off from Yharnam after an event involving the vile Blood Queen Anomalies and the executioners, and the geographic isolation reflects that social and political rupture. But the architectural detail that stands out most in Canehurst is what was built there, with what relationship to blood. The vile bloods consumed and manipulated blood, rather than merely using it as a conduit, and the castle's physical structure reflects that priority in its layout. The Canehurst servants are corpse-like, animated by something that is not quite life, but the architecture around them is intact and maintained. The castle did not fall into ruin. It was preserved in a state of suspension at the moment it was cut off. That is a different kind of decay than everywhere else in Yharnam, which is actively collapsing. Canehurst is frozen. The thing that froze it is implied to be Annalise herself, whose ability to survive decapitation and continue ruling from a headless throne suggests a relationship to death that is categorically different from anything else in the game. The Hunter's Dream, as a physical space, raises questions that the game never fully addresses. It is described as a safe space, but its architecture is that of a graveyard. The doll exists there. Gehrman exists there, initially as a prisoner or guest, depending on your interpretation. The gravestones in the Hunter's Dream bear names that are never explained. One possible reading is that those names are previous hunters who cycled through the dream and were eventually released in one form or another. Another is that they are names from Gehrman's own past, memorials to people who existed before the dream was created. The research hall in the DLC is one of the most disturbing architectural spaces in the game, because you can trace what it was built to do just by looking at the layout. The cells on the lower level where patients were kept, the operating areas on the upper levels, the Lumenwood garden on the roof where the patients who survived the experiments were apparently moved or relocated themselves. The vertical progression of the research hall maps directly onto a progression from human subject to something beyond human, and the architecture was built to facilitate that process. The Living Failures boss arena is a garden at the top of the research hall, and the implication is that the patients kept in the hall eventually made their way there through transformation rather than through walking. The failures themselves are entities that were altered by exposure to outer god influence, specifically the entity associated with the cosmos. They are called failures because they are failed attempts at something. What the successful version looks like is not shown in the game, which is a narrative choice that this video finds particularly interesting. The fishing hamlet is one of the oldest locations in the game in terms of the lore timeline, and its architecture reflects that. The structures are wooden and low, built for a fishing community, not for any religious or institutional function. What happened to the hamlet predates the Healing Church and is tied directly to the Orphan of Kos. But the architectural detail that stands out most in the hamlet is the scaffolding, the wooden platforms extending over the water at multiple points in the area. Those platforms were not built for fishing. They are too high, too elaborate, and positioned in ways that suggest ceremony rather than industry. The scaffolding at the hamlet extends over sections of the water where the celestial children walk into the sea. Connecting those two things, the ceremony suggesting scaffolding and the entities that use the water as an exit, implies that at some point the hamlet's people were participants in whatever relationship existed between the village and the sea-born entities. The scaffolding may have been observation points, or offering platforms, or something else entirely that the game does not name. But their placement is not random. The Tomb of Eden in central Yharnam is one of the game's most important locations from a story standpoint, being the site of the Aden Writhe rune, the implied site of the pregnancy that drives the early game's narrative, and the location where multiple quest lines converge. But architecturally it is small. For a space described as a tomb and ritually significant, it has minimal decoration, minimal scale, and minimal environmental storytelling compared to other significant locations. The smallness of the Tomb of Edon feels like it should mean something given how large everything connected to the church is, but the game does not comment on the contrast. The old Yharnam burning environment is one of the most deliberately staged pieces of level design in the game. The fire has been burning for long enough that certain structures have partially collapsed, but not fully, and the arrangement of those structures channels the player through specific sightlines that are clearly designed, but the fire's origin is not explained by any NPC or item description in a way that specifies who started it. The powder kegs are blamed by the healing church. Whether that attribution is accurate, or whether the church's characterization of the powder kegs as arsonists serves an institutional purpose, is left open. The central Yharnam aqueduct is an infrastructure detail that points toward a city that was once much more functional than the one the player encounters. The aqueduct connects multiple levels of the city and is still operational, still flowing with water, even as everything around it descends into chaos. Functional infrastructure in a collapsed city implies either that the chaos was very recent, which the game's timeline does not clearly support, or that whatever maintains the aqueduct is not affected by the human social collapse. Neither explanation is given. The doors in Bloodborne that cannot be opened from the player's side are one of the architectural anomaly categories that rewards systematic attention. There are doors in central Yharnam, in the Cathedral Ward, in Canehurst, in the Chalice Dungeons, that are clearly functional doors, but that have no opening mechanism. They are not locked in any way the game's systems represent. They simply face the wrong direction. The convention in game design is that an inaccessible door usually means there is content on the other side that was cut or is accessed from another direction. But some of these doors are in locations where there is no other access to what would be behind them based on the geometry, and the content that would logically be there is simply absent. The bridge over the ravine in central Yharnam that connects the main path to the shortcut leading to the cleric beast has structural damage consistent with a very specific kind of impact, not erosion or collapse, but something that hit it from below. The bridge is underside, visible if you fall into the ravine and look up before dying, shows damage patterns that suggest an upward force. What came up through the ravine and damaged the bridge from below is not addressed by any element of the game's design. The iron fences throughout the Cathedral Ward and much of Yharnam have a height and spacing that is not consistent with keeping humans in or out. The bars are too widely spaced for that purpose. They are consistent with containing something significantly larger than a human. Given that the amygdalas are present throughout the Cathedral Ward, even before they become visible to the player, and given that their scale is significantly larger than human, one reading of the fencing design is that it was originally built with those entities in mind, either to channel them or to mark boundaries they should not cross. The upper Cathedral Ward is accessed through a locked gate, whose key is acquired from a patient in Yharnam. The lore reason for that key's location is not explained. A key to a church-controlled area in the possession of a Yharnam prisoner implies either that the prisoner was taken from the upper Cathedral Ward or that the two institutions had a relationship that resulted in the key's transfer. Neither is addressed by the game's dialogue or item descriptions. The Healing Church Workshop section of the Cathedral Ward is below the main cathedral, in a way that suggests it predates the main building. The workshop's architecture is older, rougher, and its connection to the amygdala access hole in its ceiling is one of the game's most structurally loaded details. The workshop was built around that hole, or the hole was found and the workshop built below it. Either way, the presence of that breach in the architectural hierarchy of the Cathedral Ward, with the church built above what appears to be an older and more fundamental structure, suggests the church's relationship to the cosmic is parasitic on something that was already there before they arrived. The area behind the Cathedral Ward lamp, near the large locked gate to the Healing Church Workshop, contains a series of graves that are distinct from the graves in the Hunter's Dream. The Cathedral Ward graves are older in design, using a cross-based marker that predates the Healing Church's stylistic conventions. Those graves were there before the church, which means the Cathedral Ward was a burial ground before it was a religious site. What was buried there, and what the church found when it built on top of it is a detail the game plants and does not develop. The Moonside Lake, accessed through the roof of Byrgenwerth, has no visible boundary between its surface and the sky above it. The reflection of the moon on the water is perfect and unbroken. When you walk on the surface of the lake to reach the boss arena, it behaves like solid ground, not water. The implication is that you are walking on the reflection rather than the surface, that the lake has been inverted in some way that makes the reflected sky accessible. Whether this is a lore argument about the nature of what lies beyond the sky in Bloodborne's cosmology, or a visual metaphor for the act of reaching upward by going into something, the design is doing more than just creating a boss approach sequence. The Nightmare of Mensis sky is one of the most analysed visual elements in the game. The enormous moon, the hanging cage with the Mikolash hint, the reddish light that colours everything, but the detail that most analysis overlooks is the stars. The star pattern in the Nightmare sky does not match the star pattern visible from the surface of Yharnam during the early game's night sections. They are different skies. Whether the Nightmare of Mensis occupies a different cosmological position than Yharnam, or whether the stars were simply designed without reference to each other, the difference is there. You are looking at a different sky. The cave systems beneath the Nightmare frontier, the ones that lead to the Amygdala boss arena, have a geological character inconsistent with the rocky exterior of the frontier. Above, the exterior is mountainous, cold, and barren. The caves beneath it are warm, lit from within by a source that is not fire and not the ambient light of the Nightmare sky. That internal lighting, warm and sourceless, is the same quality as the lighting in areas associated with the kin throughout the game. The cave system feels like it belongs to a different space, accessible from the frontier, but not originally part of it. The astral clock tower mentioned in the choir set description is worth returning to in the context of architecture specifically. A clock tower implies a specific kind of civic or institutional building, one that keeps and broadcasts time to a community. The existence of a clock tower in a world where time does not behave normally, where the hunt cycles and the nightmares persist without clear temporal markers, is either a historical artifact from before the hunt began, or a functional infrastructure designed for a community that needed to track something other than conventional time. The iron door, leading from the central Yharnam lamp area toward the Cleric Beast Canyon, approach has architectural moulding around its frame that is more elaborate than any other door in the game's early section. The moulding references motifs that appear on the Healing Church buildings much later in the game, which implies the door was decorated either by the church or with church approval. A church-decorated door on a path that leads to a beast suggests either the church was present in that location before the events of the game, or the door itself predates the current church, which is architecturally impossible given the motif dates. The contradiction is small, but it is persistent. The water tower structures visible on the rooftops of central Yharnam and the cathedral ward are not connected to any accessible interior. They are too large to be purely decorative. Their placement follows a regular distribution pattern across the city that suggests they were part of a water distribution system. Similar to the aqueduct, the Healing Church's use of water in purification rites, specifically the White Church set's description of cleansing blood with water, connects water infrastructure to religious practice in a way that makes the unreachable water towers potentially ceremonial as well as functional. The Forbidden Woods shortcut gate, the one that opens from the far side and cannot be opened from the near side, creates a one-way passage that implies the path was designed to be traversed in the opposite direction from how the player first encounters it. The design of the Forbidden Woods as a whole supports this, with the area making more geographic sense if approached from Byrgenwerth toward Yharnam rather than from Yharnam toward Byrgenwerth. Whether this suggests an alternate intended progression order or is simply a shortcut designed for revisits, the directionality of the gate's design is interesting in context. The old Healing Church building in the Cathedral Ward, the one from which Vicar Amelia's room extends, has a library section whose shelves are fully populated with books that cannot be read or interacted with. This is common in games, of course, shelf filling as environmental dressing. but the Bloodborne books are specifically placed at heights that no human could access without a ladder, and no ladder is present. Either whoever populated those shelves had access to a ladder that is now absent, or whoever populated those shelves was taller than a human. Given the church giants, who served the church and their institutional relationship with the healing church, one reading of the unreachable books is that they were filed by entities for whom that height was not a practical problem. Chapter 3: The Sounds That Are Not Music. Bloodborne's soundtrack is one of the most discussed soundscapes in modern game design, but this chapter is not about the music, it is about what is happening underneath and around the music. The ambient sound design in Bloodborne contains details that most players register subconsciously, but never isolate. Things that are not musical, not environmental, and not entirely explainable. The most well documented of these is the crying in the Nightmare of Mensis. Murgo cries. That is established by the game's narrative. Murgo's cry is the source of the nightmares affecting Yharnam. But if you stand in certain corners of the research hall in the DLC, at certain points, before you have progressed through the nightmare sections, there is an audio layer underneath the ambient sound that is not the same cry. It is lower in frequency. It does not loop in the same way. It sounds less like an infant and more like something much larger, attempting an infant's sound. The fishing hamlet has an audio detail that many players have reported, but that has not been definitively isolated in extracted game files. There is a sound in the deeper water sections of the hamlet that resembles breathing, not the breathing of an enemy, not the breathing of the player character, but a low rhythmic sound from the direction of the water. Given the presence of the Kos parasite, and the implication that the god Kos may not be entirely absent from the hamlet, one reading of that sound is exactly what it appears to be. Something large, in the water, still alive in some form. The abandoned workshop in the hunter's dream contains an object that can be examined but not used, the plain doll sitting inactive in the corner, and the room itself has a specific audio layer that does not appear in the main dream area directly outside it. It is quieter, but not silent. There is a very faint, low-register hum in the abandoned workshop that a number of players have identified as matching, in frequency, one of the notes from the workshop exterior's ambient track, but slowed down to approximately 1/8 its normal speed. Whether this is intentional design or an artifact of how the audio was constructed, it creates an effect that makes the workshop feel temporarily displaced from everything around it. The boss music for Ebrietas is worth specific attention here because it contains a vocal element that does not appear in any other boss track in the game. Almost all of Bloodborne's boss themes use orchestral instrumentation with occasional choral elements. Ebrietas' track has a vocal layer that some analysts have described as attempting speech rather than melody. The phonemes in it are inconsistent with Latin or any other language used in the soundtrack, and they occur in a rhythmic pattern that does not match the musical structure of the piece. They are not singing along, they are saying something else. The amygdala sound design is one of the more intentional uses of audio dissonance in the game. The sound an amygdala makes when it becomes visible, the reveal moment in Cathedral Ward, or Upper Cathedral Ward, is a layered effect that combines at least 3 distinct audio elements. One is the sound used for general arcane effects in the game. One is a slowed and pitch-shifted version of the hunter's laugh animation, and one is a sound that does not appear to have a second use anywhere in the game's audio design. That third layer is the one that makes the amygdala reveal feel different from every other sudden appearance moment in a game full of them. The music box item, the one associated with Gehrman's past and with the woman whose hair the plain doll was styled after, plays a melody when used. That melody recurs in the game's ending theme, in the childhood's beginning ending. The connection between the music box's melody and the doll's appearance, and the fact that the melody reappears when the player ascends to become a great one, suggests that the woman Gehrman mourns is connected to the transformation that ending represents. It is a musical argument that runs across the entire game's runtime. The lecture building has essentially no ambient sound. Most indoor locations in Bloodborne have some form of environmental audio: wind, water, crackling fire, distant movement. The lecture building has almost nothing. There is a very faint low-frequency drone that can be heard if you listen carefully, but it is so subtle that most players do not notice it at all. The absence of normal ambient sound in a space that should have environmental audio is a design choice that makes the building feel isolated in a way that its visual design alone could not achieve. The sound the winter lanterns make when they spot you is a two-part effect. There is an initial tone, high and clean, like a struck glass, and then underneath it there is a layered texture of what some audio analysts have described as overlapping voices. Not words, not melody, something in between. The frenzy mechanic that activates when they see you is associated with encountering a truth your mind cannot process. And the audio design for that activation seems built to make you feel the processing failure before the visual effect communicates it. The Orphan of Kos screams when you fight him. That is not unusual for a boss in any game. What is unusual about it is that the scream changes between Phase 1 and Phase 2. In Phase 1, the scream has a recognizable profile, a sharp attack, and a relatively quick decay. In Phase 2, the scream loses its clean attack transient, and instead has a sustained unresolved quality that does not decay in a normal way. It lingers. That Phase 2 scream is one of the more genuinely upsetting sounds in the game because it does not behave like a sound that has an end. The message audio cue for picking up items from fallen enemies is subtle in Bloodborne compared to other action RPGs, which tend to use a more celebratory pickup sound. Bloodborne's version is small and dry, but there is a variant of it that plays when you collect certain items from certain enemies, specifically some kin enemies and some unique drops from dungeon bosses. That is pitched slightly differently. The difference is small enough that most players never register it consciously. But if you compare recordings side by side, it is clearly a distinct asset. Whether this was intentional differentiation between item tiers or an accident of the audio pipeline is an open question. The Great One Cold Blood item, which drops from specific kin enemies and grants large amounts of blood echoes when consumed, has an activation sound that is unlike every other consumable in the game. When you use it, instead of the standard consumption sound, there is a brief stereo effect that pans from left to right and then back, over approximately half a second. That panning motion, that sense of something passing through rather than being absorbed, is a small audio detail that says something about what the cold blood actually is in lore terms. You are not absorbing it. It is passing through you on its way somewhere else. The choir enemies in Yosefka's clinic make a sound when they move that is unique to them. It is a soft, repetitive, wet sound that suggests the transformation they have undergone is not complete. They move as though the biological process is still ongoing. That sound is distinct from the sounds made by similar transformation stage enemies in other parts of the game. Like the patients in the early game, the patients sound like they are in pain. The choir enemies in Yosefka's sound like they are in the process of becoming something, not resisting it. The cathedral ward amygdala, the one that becomes visible after you acquire a certain amount of insight, has a sound design difference from the amygdala in the Hunter's Nightmare. The cathedral ward version, when you approach it, has an audio layer that includes a resonance that matches the bells used in the Healing Church visual design. The bell motif that appears throughout the ward architecture, whether this is a subliminal connection between the church and the amygdalas, suggesting the church knew they were there and incorporated their presence into the aesthetic language of their buildings, is one of the readings this video finds most compelling. The cleric beast's attack sounds include a specific bark on one of its overhead slam attacks that does not appear in any of its other attack sounds. All of the cleric beast's other vocalizations are variations on the same bass sound, a deep animal cry. This single bark is shorter, cleaner, and has a quality that is closer to language than animal noise. It is one syllable. Whether this was intentional or an audio asset that was mislabeled and applied to the wrong attack, it creates a moment in the cleric beast fight that is subtly different from everything else happening in that encounter. The Hemwick Charnel Lane environmental audio includes a sound in the exterior areas before entering the building with the Witch of Hemwick. That is specifically a candle burning sound, not fire, not wind, specifically the small, steady sound of a candle flame, but there are no visible candles in the exterior Hemwick environment. The environmental sound is playing for a light source that is not there. Whether this is a holdover from an earlier version of the area's design, where candles were present in the exterior, or whether the sound is meant to imply candles that the player cannot see, the disconnect between audio and visual is consistent throughout the Hemwick exterior. The Shadows of Yharnam boss encounter has a specific audio layer during the fight that appears only when all three shadows are alive simultaneously and is absent when one has been killed. That layer is a harmonic that sits underneath the boss theme and is connected to the chanting element in the track. Its removal when a shadow dies suggests it was generated by the presence of the three entities together, rather than being a fixed part of the music. The music responds to the state of the fight in a way that is not purely cosmetic. It is acoustically tracking the group's completeness. The sound of the plain doll's laughter, heard when she gives you a level-up interaction if you've spent a long time with her during one session, is one of the most discussed sounds in the game's community. The laugh is brief, very quiet, and does not occur every time. Multiple playthroughs can go by without hearing it. Players who have heard it consistently describe it as more genuine than her speaking voice, less performed. Whether the doll was designed to laugh, and the laugh was made rare to preserve its impact, or whether it was an audio artifact that was noticed and left in, is something no one has definitively established. The Blood Dreg collection sound, the effect that plays when a vile blood player absorbs a blood dreg from a defeated opponent, is completely unique in the game's audio library. Every other consumable or collectible uses a variant of a standard absorption or pickup sound. The blood dreg sound is something different. A quiet, resonant tone with a specific emotional register that most players describe as being neither positive nor negative, just distinct. Given that blood dregs are the currency of an alternate blood philosophy, the decision to give them their own collection sound, rather than reusing the standard asset, is an investment that implies they were considered significant in a way the general design does not fully develop. The research hall's elevator sound, the platform that descends from the Lumenwood garden into the main hall, is mechanically identical to every other elevator in the game in function, but the audio design for it is different from every other elevator in Bloodborne. Every other vertical transit in the game uses a grinding industrial sound appropriate to old machinery. The research hall elevator uses a sound that has a biological quality to it, not quite organic but not metallic either. Given what the research hall is doing to the bodies of its patients and what the elevator connects, the choice to give that specific transit a non-mechanical sound seems deliberate. The amygdala grab attack, used in the Hunter's Nightmare version of the fight specifically, has a sound that does not play until the player has been held for approximately 1 second, rather than playing immediately on contact. That delay between the grab and its sound is unique to that specific attack in that specific boss. In every other grab attack in the game, the contact sound plays on the frame of contact. The delay in the Nightmare amygdala's grab creates a moment of silence that is more disturbing than the sound itself would be, because the absence of expected sensory feedback is its own form of ROM. The sound of the lamp activation, the effect that plays when you interact with a lamp to access the hunter's dream, is one of the most consistent sounds in the game, used for every lamp across every area. But there is one lamp whose activation sound has an additional overtone that no other lamp shares. The lamp in the abandoned old workshop, the optional one you can access through the hidden passage in the Healing Church workshop. That lamp's activation sound has a note in it that is not present in the standard lamp audio. It is higher in frequency and it decays more slowly. Every player who discovers that lamp hears it differently from every other lamp in the game. Whether that difference was built in or emerged from how the audio was processed for that specific location is the kind of question this game consistently refuses to answer. The Hunter's Nightmare ambient track, which plays throughout the DLC's first major area, contains a musical phrase that appears in the vanilla game's Yahargul nighttime ambient track. The phrase is not identical. It has been altered in key and tempo, but the melodic shape is recognizable if you listen to both back-to-back. The connection between the Hunter's Nightmare and Yahargul is lore-supported through Ludwig's history. and the events that precipitated the nightmare's existence. But the audio connection, the shared melodic material between the two areas, is the kind of design choice that rewards the very small number of players who have spent enough time in both areas to notice it. The sound design for the player's own footsteps changes between different surfaces in Bloodborne in ways that most players never consciously process. Stone, wood, water, grass all have distinct footstep audio, but there is a surface type, specifically the floor of the upper cathedral ward nave, where the footstep sound has a resonance quality inconsistent with the stone floor of that size. Stone floors in large spaces produce a particular kind of echo. The upper cathedral ward nave produces a different quality of resonance, one that suggests the space beneath the floor is hollow. Given the existence of the Healing Church workshop below the ward and the connections between them, that hollow resonance is either acoustically accurate to the geometry of the building or a deliberate sound design choice to make that floor feel different without visual support. The sound played when the blood moon rises over Yharnam is one of the game's most impactful audio moments, and also one of its least analysed. It is not a musical transition, it is not a boss fanfare. It is a sound that begins before the visual change and continues for several seconds after the sky has changed, like an audio event that is larger than the visual transition it accompanies. That overlap, the sound starting before and ending after the visual, gives the blood moon transition a quality that makes it feel like something that is happening to the world rather than a triggered cutscene. The audio is doing narrative work that the visual alone would not accomplish. The doll's humming, audible from a slight distance when you approach her from the garden entrance to the dream rather than from the main gate, is not a composed melody. It is a fragment of what might become a melody, stopping and starting as if she is remembering rather than performing. The specific tones she uses appear twice in the game's main musical score, in the ending title screen music, and in the main menu theme that plays during the game's main splash screen. Whether the doll is humming the game's theme or the game's theme was composed to match the doll's humming is the kind of circular design question Bloodborne is full of. The sound of blood in Bloodborne is not one sound. It is a library of sounds differentiated by source, volume, and context. The blood that runs from enemies when struck has a different audio signature from the blood that the player recovers from fallen enemies. The blood that pours during the consumption of pungent blood cocktails is different again. The blood that appears during cutscenes, specifically the sequences involving the umbilical cords and the Great Horn events, has the most distinct sound of all, a sound that suggests something pressurized and significant rather than a biological byproduct. The game built a sound taxonomy for blood, which is exactly the kind of design investment you make when blood is the thematic foundation of everything you are trying to say. The final sound worth noting in this chapter is one that some players describe as occurring after you defeat the final boss of the base game in the bad ending, the Gehrman fight, where you accept release. After the ending cutscene completes and the credits begin, before the main menu music starts, there is a very brief moment of audio, less than 2 seconds, between the end of the ending sound design and the beginning of the credits music. Most players, watching the credits, do not notice it, but players who have been paying attention to the game's audio design report that those 2 seconds contain a sound they associate with the messengers, the small movement sound those entities make when they are present. It implies that even in death, the messengers are there. Chapter 4. The Law That Was Left Incomplete. Every From Software game has content that was planned and cut, or content that was left in the game in a state that suggests something larger was originally intended. Bloodborne is particularly rich in this category, partly because of the Chalice dungeon system, which is deep enough that it could contain almost anything without a typical player ever encountering it, and partly because the game's development was clearly not without its constraints. The most commonly discussed cut content in Bloodborne is the additional Alfred questline elements. Alfred, the executioner who worships Ligarius and seeks to purge the Vile Bloods, has a questline that is functional but relatively short. There are item descriptions and dialogue elements that suggest a larger planned arc involving Alfred's eventual fate, specifically a version of events where Alfred's devotion to Ligarius leads him to undergo a transformation that the current game only implies from a distance. The Alfred you encounter at the end of his questline has clearly undergone something. The game does not show you what. The Canehurst Executioner garb item set includes a description that references a faction called the Vickers Hunters, a group that predates the Executioners and operated under a different mandate. There is no Vicar in the current game whose identity maps cleanly to this reference. The Vicar title is used for Amelia, but the description implies a human leader of a now defunct faction, not a boss character. One possible reading is that this is a reference to a planned NPC whose questline did not make it to final release. The presence of Yosefka as a duplicated character, one version outside her clinic, at the game's beginning, and a different entity operating from within after a certain point in the story, is one of the game's most discussed mysteries, and also one of its most structurally interesting anomalies. The fake Iosefka's objectives are clear. She is transforming patients sent to her into kin, but her motivation, who she is and why she is doing this, is conveyed entirely through implication. Item descriptions associated with her drop items, specifically the umbilical cord she drops if killed late, suggests she was attempting to gestate or make herself a vessel for a Great One's child. Why she was doing this, and who or what instructed her, is the part the game leaves unresolved. The old hunter badge and its associated item unlocks suggest a faction of hunters that was active before Gehrman founded the workshop, operating under different principles and with different tools. The weapons unlocked by old hunter badges have descriptions that suggest they were designed for a specific purpose or a specific type of target that the current game's enemies do not include. The rifle spear, for example, is described as a weapon made for hunting something specific, but the description does not name what. That specificity, a weapon made for a named target that is never named, is one of the forms of incomplete lore the game uses consistently. The tonsil stone is an item given to the player by an NPC who insists, with an intensity that suggests genuine terror, that you take it to the one that created it. The one in question is an amygdala, specifically the amygdala that appears in the lecture building. Using the tonsil stone in the presence of that amygdala is the trigger for accessing the hunter's nightmare, but the NPC who gives it to you, and the urgency of their insistence, suggests a narrative context for the item that the game does not develop. Who gave the stone to the NPC? What was the original purpose of presenting it to the amygdala? The 3/3 of umbilical cord mechanic, where collecting 3 of the 4 available umbilical cords and consuming them before the final boss triggers an alternate ending, is one of the most structurally elegant things in the game, but also one of the most incomplete from a lore standpoint. The 4th cord, the one you can have all 4 but only need 3, is Murgo's cord, obtained from the wet nurse. Consuming it as part of the set that elevates you to Great One status raises a question the game does not answer. What role does Murgo's cord specifically play in that transformation, and why is one cord sufficient to replace any of the others? The Yahar Gul, Unseen Village, was apparently a location that underwent significant redesign between planning and release. The area has 2 distinct phases, one during daytime and one during nighttime. And the nighttime version, accessed after being captured by the Snatchers, contains enemies and environmental details that do not have clear narrative connections to the daytime version. The Yahar Hunters, in particular, are a group whose motivations and organization are implied by their gear, but never explained by any character in the game. The choir set description mentions an event called the choir's Ritual of the Astral Clock Tower, which is a location that does not exist in the game. The Astral Clock Tower appears only in one item description, and nowhere else. It is either a location that was cut from the game, or a location that exists in the world, but is never accessible to the player. Either way, a ritual significant enough to be named in a major faction's equipment description that has no corresponding location is a gap that points towards something missing. The Riaita Palash weapons description mentions a connection to Canehurst and the Vile Blood Queen in a way that suggests it was originally a more plot-relevant item than its function in the game suggests. It is used as a catalyst for arcane, alongside its physical attack, which is mechanically unusual for a skill weapon. The item description frames this dual nature as a Canehurst innovation, implying that the Vile Bloods had a different understanding of the relationship between physical and arcane power than the Healing Church. But framing suggests a larger planned storyline around Cainhurst's approach to the arcane that was either cut or compressed. The Beast's Embrace rune, which transforms the player's moveset into something that resembles beast form and is associated with the idea of accepting the beast, is one of the game's most interesting ambiguous elements. Equipping it suggests a third path between resisting beasthood and succumbing to it, a deliberate and conscious acceptance. But the game does not develop that third path beyond the mechanical changes to your moveset. There is no questline that responds to the choice. No NPC acknowledges it. No ending reflects it. It feels like the entry point to a storyline that was not completed. The Pthumerian Descendant boss, who appears in Chalice dungeons, fights with a moveset that is unlike any surface enemy in the game. His speed and his weapon usage, the multiple blades and the acrobatic style, are closer to a player character build than to anything an NPC would use. The item lore associated with the Pthumerians suggests they were an ancient race who discovered and maintained the Great One's tombs. The Descendant's fighting style implies he was trained for something specific, and the tomb environment he is found in implies that training was for protecting the tombs. But nothing in the game connects those two elements explicitly. The church servants in the Healing Church locations carry large weapons that are impractical for any defensive purpose, the huge curved blades and oversized hammers. They are slow, they are telegraphed, and they are powerful. The item description for the church pick, a weapon dropped by similar enemies in the Hunter's Nightmare, describes it as a tool for a very specific kind of work involving the blood of beasts. If the church servants were originally designed as workers rather than guards, the current encounter design, which positions them as guard-type enemies, represents a function shift whose narrative context is not explained. The Winter Lantern's connection to the plain doll is the incomplete lore thread that this video finds most compelling. The visual similarity between them is hard to dismiss. The doll's face appears on the bodies of the Winter Lanterns in a form that is inverted or corrupted. The doll herself, in her dialogue, speaks in ways that suggest she was created specifically for the Hunter's dream, and that her design was based on something or someone that Gehrman wanted. If the Winter Lanterns represent the doll's form as it appears in Nightmare space, warped by proximity to the Great Ones, then what are they doing in the Nightmare of Mensis? A nightmare associated with the School of Mensis rather than the Hunter's Workshop? The Madman's Knowledge and Great One's Wisdom item descriptions both describe things found in the nightmares, extracted from the dream spaces, and returned to the waking world. But neither description explains the mechanism of that extraction. Who goes into the nightmare to find these things? The game's NPC hunters do not describe doing this. The School of Mensis entered the nightmare but does not describe extracting insight items from it. One reading is that these items wash up naturally in Yharnam from nightmare to waking world, without human intervention. Another is that someone is collecting them from the nightmares and distributing them, and that someone is never identified. The Messenger Urn Festival item, which is a thrown weapon that summons a messenger-related effect, has an item description that references a ceremony called the Messenger Festival, which is not documented anywhere else in the game. The existence of a ceremony involving the messengers implies they have a social or ritual function beyond serving as silent couriers between hunters. Whether the festival was a piece of lore designed to add texture to the messengers, or was the fragment of a more complete messenger-focused questline, its isolation is one of the more interesting small gaps in the game's world building. The Pebble item, Bloodborne's equivalent of a distraction-throwing rock, has an item description that references its use by hunters as a tool of the trade, implying it is a standard piece of equipment. But the Pebble's description also contains a line about its effectiveness decreasing over time as beasts become accustomed to the sound, that implies a world in which hunter-beast interactions happen over extended periods, where individual encounters are part of a longer relationship of adaptation on both sides. The Pebbles item description is about an ongoing hunt. The player's experience of the game is a single night. The gap between those two timeframes is something the incomplete lore thread of the pebble gestures without resolving. The saw cleaver and hunter's axe item descriptions both reference their design as being optimal for hunting beasts at the expense of versatility. But framing implies they were developed to address a specific problem that had been encountered and documented, which means there is a history of hunters encountering beasts and finding their existing tools insufficient, which means there was a pre-beast crisis hunting tradition, whose tools those were. That prior tradition is referenced but never populated with specific hunters, specific tools, or specific context. The empty phantasm shell item description talks about Canehurst knowledge of empty phantasms and their infusion into weapons. The connection between Canehurst and phantasm lore is significant because phantasms are also connected to the fishing hamlet and to cost-related items, whether Canehurst independently discovered phantasm applications, or whether their knowledge derived from the same source as the hamlet's relationship with Kos, is a connection the game plants and does not follow. The Old Blood's description, in various forms across multiple items, consistently frames it as something found rather than created, something the Pthumerians discovered rather than made. That framing puts the Old Blood in the same category as the Great Ones themselves in terms of its origin, something that predates human civilization and was simply encountered. The lore implication that the entire Healing Church's power base rests on something they found and did not understand is not fully developed by any single character or quest line. It is a systemic argument that emerges from reading multiple item descriptions together. The formless Edon rune and its associated lore are one of the most philosophically interesting incomplete threads in the game. Edon is described as formless, existing only in the voices and blood of others. The rune, that represents communion with Odin, provides a game mechanic benefit tied to visceral attacks. The connection between the intimate violence of a visceral attack and Odin's presence in the blood suggests a relationship that has implications for almost every major narrative event in the game, most of which involve blood being shed in significant ways. But the game never makes that connection explicit. The College of the Healing Church, referenced in item descriptions but never depicted as a location, is implied to be where the choir and other high-ranking church members were trained. Its non-appearance as an accessible location, despite being described as an institutional structure with a curriculum and a hierarchy, is one of the larger architectural gaps in Bloodborne's world building. A church with this much power and this much reach, operating in a city with buildings of this scale, should have a school. That school is named but has no coordinates. The Black Church set and White Church set, both belonging to Healing Church operatives of different functions, have descriptions that imply a doctrinal division within the church that is never explored through any questline or boss encounter. The Black Church operatives work in lower functions, while the White Church operatives are focused on blood purification. That division, which maps roughly onto practical versus theological functions, suggests internal politics that the game might have explored through characters and did not. The Shaman Bone Blade item, which can be used to turn enemies against each other, has a description rooted in shamanic practice that is not connected to any other lore element in the game. Shamanism as a practice is not referenced anywhere in Bloodborne's institutional lore. It does not appear in the Healing Church's methodology, in Bergenworth's research, in the Canehurst Vileblood tradition, or in any hunter faction. The Shaman Bone Blade is a functional item with a description that floats free of the game's established frameworks. One reading is that it comes from a tradition older than any of the named factions, which implies a depth of history the game never populates. The sinister resonant bell description references a bell maiden's duty to beckon hunters from other worlds. That duty implies an institution, an organization that assigns bell maidens to locations and trains them in their function. The individual bell maidens you encounter in the game are solitary, but the description implies they are part of a coordinated system. That system is not populated with characters, locations, or history. It exists only in the description of the item that lets it be disrupted. The gold pendant worn by Father Gascoigne, the item you acquire from his body if you kill him before meeting his daughter, is one of the most emotionally specific items in the game without being one of the most lore-rich. The description is short. It simply says the pendant was a keepsake from Gascoigne's early days, before he was a hunter. The before he was a hunter is what makes the description incomplete. Every other hunter in the game is defined entirely by their hunting career. The pendant is the only hint that Gascoigne had a life before the hunt that he remembered and chose to carry with him. What that life was is not something the game addresses. The Pthumerian script that appears on walls in the Chalice dungeons has been partially translated by the community, with most of the translated sections referencing directions, warnings, and ritual instructions. But a portion of the script in the deepest dungeons has not been translated, either because it is a different script entirely, or because the characters used do not correspond to the pattern established in the translatable sections. The existence of a second layer of Pthumerian writing, potentially in a different language or a more specialized script, implies a level of cultural and institutional complexity in the Pthumerian civilization that the game does not develop. Chapter 5. The Chalice Dungeon Anomalies. The Chalice dungeons are the part of Bloodborne that most players engage with least, and they are the part that contains the most unexplained content. They are procedurally generated in most of their configurations, but certain dungeons are fixed, either the story path dungeons or the route dungeons that players share through glyph codes. In those fixed spaces there are encounters, items, and environmental details that do not fit cleanly into the game's established framework. The Pthumerian labyrinth is structured differently from any above-ground area in Bloodborne, in ways that are not just visual. The geometry of the dungeon levels does not correspond to any surface location. There is no relationship between where you enter a dungeon and what exists above it, geographically. One reading of this is that the dungeons are not physically below Yharnam, but are instead spatially separated from it, in a way that resembles the nightmare spaces. You descend into them through a ritual involving chalices and materials, rather than through any geographic passage. The Watchdog of the Old Lords is a boss whose design does not match anything else in the dungeon bestiary. Most Chalice dungeon bosses are humanoid variants or beast variants of surface enemies. The Watchdog is a massive dog-like creature entirely composed of fire and old bone. The Old Lords in its name suggests it is ancient, even by dungeon standards, predating the Pthumerians, or at minimum predating the period when the Pthumerians were intact as a civilization. What the Old Lords were, how the Watchdog was created to serve them, and what it was watching over are questions the game raises entirely through the boss's name and appearance. The Loran Dark Beast is the deepest dungeon boss in the Loran branch, and is one of the most graphically alien boss designs in the game. The creature is skeletal, massive, and generates its own lightning. The item obtained from defeating it connects to the history of Loran's destruction, and the beast's behavior, specifically its apparent attempt to flee the arena rather than engage the player, is unlike any other boss in the game. It does not want to fight. Whether that suggests it is a tormented remnant of something that was once not a beast, or simply a creature responding to its environment in a way no other enemy does, is left to interpretation. The fluorescent flowers appear in Chalice dungeons in configurations that are more organized than their surface placements. On the surface, they appear to grow organically, as you might expect plants to grow. In patches and clusters, in certain dungeon rooms, they are arranged in rows. That arrangement, that deliberate placement, implies cultivation. Given that the flowers attack using a method that inflicts slow accumulation of frenzy, one possible purpose for cultivating them in enclosed underground rooms is a form of torture, or conditioning, or possibly a harvest operation for something the flowers produce. The Queen Yharnam fight in the deepest Chalice dungeon is the game's most significant narrative event that the majority of players never see. Yharnam, Pthumerian Queen, is visually one of the most distinctive characters in the game, her design clearly communicating royalty, age, and an intimate relationship with blood. She holds a child during the fight. The child she holds is relevant to the overall story of the game, in ways that the surface narrative only implies. The fact that the game's most important piece of lore contextualization for the entire blood healing mythology is locked behind the deepest, most inaccessible layer of the optional dungeon system, is a design choice that either reflects a deliberate obscuring of the truth or a casualness about where important information is placed that borders on chaotic. The Chalice Dungeon version of the church has rooms that are architecturally identical to rooms in the Surface Cathedral ward, but with different enemies and different item placements. This suggests either a shared construction origin between the dungeon structures and the cathedral ward, or a deliberate mimicry where someone built underground rooms to resemble the church spaces above. If it is the latter, the question of why becomes one of the more interesting mysteries in the dungeon system. The sinister chalice variants of dungeons, which enable PvP invasion by other players, contain enemy variants with different names and slightly different stats from their standard counterparts. The naming convention for sinister variants implies a different character of blood resonance in those spaces. Whether the game's lore supports a meaningful distinction between sinister and standard dungeon spaces beyond the mechanical PvP difference is something the item descriptions gesture at without committing to. The Hintertomb environments in the Chalice dungeons contain a water element that does not appear in the other dungeon branches. The Hintertombs are flooded in places in a way that suggests the water table has risen into spaces that were not designed to be wet. The item descriptions associated with Hintertomb materials reference burial practices that differ from those in the main Pthumerian branch, and the enemies in the Hintertombs include variants that do not appear anywhere else. The secret Chalice dungeon areas, accessible only through specific glyph codes shared by the community, contain rooms that appear to have been intended for content that was never implemented. Empty boss arenas with no boss, chests, containing only basic materials and spaces decorated as though they were significant locations. Staircases that lead to walls that have no door seams. Whether these are procedural generation artifacts or preserved remnants of content that was removed from the pool of possible dungeon content is something that the game's file structure has not settled definitively. The Great Pthumeru Ihil Chalice, the final dungeon in the story branch, requires materials called Bastard of Loran and a living string to create. The living string's item description is the most explicit statement in the entire game about the Mensis ritual and what the school was attempting to do. And the fact that accessing the deepest dungeon requires a piece of that ritual's physical substrate suggests a connection between the Mensis experiment and the Pthumerian bloodline that is not spelled out anywhere in direct dialogue. The Great One Stomping Grounds, a community nickname for certain dungeon rooms that contain the heavy footstep audio cue without any visible source, are documented in enough player reports across enough different glyph codes that they appear to be a consistent feature rather than an individual bug or anomaly. The sound is the same heavy impact used for the amygdala boss's foot stomp attack. An amygdala-scale entity moving through dungeon space without being visible is either an engine artifact or an environmental storytelling choice. Given Bloodborne's consistent willingness to use audio to imply presence, the second reading is at least as plausible as the first. The Gravestone Chalice environments have a lighting color that is slightly different from any other dungeon branch. A faint green cast that does not correspond to any light source visible in the rooms. The branch is specifically associated with the kin and with celestial locations in the lore, and the green color temperature is used elsewhere in the game for kin-associated visual effects. Whether the environments are meant to imply that the player is physically closer to something cosmic, or whether the lighting is a residual visual association from asset design, is an open question. The Depth 5 Defiled Chalice is the most mechanically challenging content in the game, featuring a halved health bar and a set of bosses that are already among the hardest in the dungeon system. The defiled concept in the lore is associated with blood that has been contaminated or corrupted in ways that the standard rituals cannot address. But the defiled chalice's specific challenge design, the health reduction in particular, implies something about the nature of defilement that is mechanical rather than purely aesthetic. You are weakened by proximity to it. The wandering nightmares in Chalice dungeons are small enemies that function as walking loot containers. They are found in all dungeon branches, but more frequently in the deeper ones. And they have a behavior pattern where they attempt to flee rather than fight. The item they drop when killed, Cold Blood, connects to the Great One Cold Blood discussed in an earlier chapter. The implication that wandering nightmares are small echoes of something much larger that have detached and are now drifting through the dungeon spaces is supported loosely by the way their behavior and drop table interact. The Chalice dungeon treasure rooms, specifically the ones in fixed dungeons that contain guaranteed high-value materials, are often placed in architecturally significant locations that do not match the treasure room template used in procedural dungeons. The fixed treasure rooms appear to have been designed for specific encounters or narrative moments that did not survive to the final game, with layouts suggesting an interaction or event that is no longer there. The cramped dungeon rooms that appear in all dungeon branches without appearing in surface areas are a design element that players rarely discuss. Their dimensions are not human-scaled, but are also not scaled for any specific enemy type encountered in those dungeons. They are too small for the large boss enemies and too specifically shaped to be the result of procedural generation. They appear to have been designed for something that does not appear in the game. That absence, a room scaled for something that is not present, is one of the dungeon's more quietly persistent anomalies. The labyrinthine altar rooms, which appear in the deeper dungeon branches and are marked by a specific floor pattern and an elevated platform, do not consistently contain anything on the altar. Some have items. Some have enemies positioned as if guarding something that is not there. Some have nothing. The inconsistency of altar content, despite the consistent effort involved in designing and populating the altar environment, suggests that the content populating system for those rooms was never fully implemented or was partially removed. The dungeon version of the pungent blood cocktail item drop table is different from the surface version in that it includes a material variant called Ritual Blood tier in the surface game. This material is functionally useless. It cannot be used in any chalice creation the player can access, but its existence in the drop table implies a chalice it was designed to be used in that was either removed or not implemented. A material with no application is a gap in a functional system. The Pthumerian undead in the dungeon halls, the basic enemy type of most dungeon levels, have a rare behavior where they will stop attacking the player mid-combat and turn to face a specific wall. They hold that position for approximately 3 seconds before resuming their attack. The wall they face is never the same between encounters. It is not always the same wall in the same room. The behavior fires randomly and does not appear to be connected to any external trigger. Players who have documented this behavior have found it occurring in every dungeon branch, but not in every room. Its distribution is too consistent to be a random animation glitch, and too inconsistent to be a deliberate triggered behavior. The living strings visual model, when you rotate the item in the inventory, reveals small faces within the tissue structure. Those faces are human in proportion. The living string drops from the brain of Mensis after you lower it into the pit. Whether the faces in the tissue represent the scholars who performed the Mensis ritual and were consumed by the brain, or whether they are a visual design choice that communicates the brain's nature as an accumulation of human minds. The detail is there, and it is not something most players examine. The Bastard of Loran, the other rare material needed for the deepest chalice, drops from abhorrent beasts. Its name references Loran's destruction, but its drop source is a beast with electrical abilities, whose origin the game does not trace to Loran directly. The disconnection between the item's name and its drop source implies either that the abhorrent beast has a Loran origin that the game does not articulate, or that the item's name was assigned before the drop source was finalized and the connection was not updated. Either explanation points towards something in the development process that was not reconciled. The amygdala, that appears as a boss in the Hill Chalice dungeons, has significantly more health and deals more damage than the amygdala in the Hunter's Nightmare, or any other location in the game. The scaling across dungeon depth is expected. What is not explained is a behavioral difference specific to the Hill amygdala. It uses a grab attack variant that no other amygdala in the game uses, one that lifts the player and holds them before slamming them down. That unique move, appearing only in the deepest dungeon variant of this enemy, implies either a boss-specific version designed for that location or a move-set element that was planned for the surface amygdala encounters, and was eventually placed only in the dungeons. The dungeon chalice glyphs, shared by the community for farming specific items, represent a version of the game's content that was never intended to be static. The procedural dungeons were designed to generate new content with each creation. The fact that specific glyphs are shared and kept alive by community members because they contain desirable content reflects a pattern where the players have essentially curated a library from what the game generated, preserving configurations that the development team never specifically designed to be permanent. That is one of the stranger relationships between a game and its player base in contemporary game design. The Is branch's connection to Ebrietas, a great one found in the cathedral ward, rather than any dungeon location, is implied by the shared visual language between the Is environments and Ebrietas' boss arena, the purple-blue atmospheric quality, the distant cosmic light, the geometry of the spaces. If Ebrietas was found in an Is-type space and brought to the cathedral ward by the healing church, then the Is dungeons represent the environment she came from. That connection between the deepest dungeon branch and the most accessible Great One encounter in the main game is one of the dungeon's most interesting thematic contributions. The dungeon boss encounter rate, specifically the frequency of finding optional side bosses in generated route dungeons, is higher than any other generated content game in the same period of releases by a significant margin. From Software built a system that consistently generates more content per depth level than the player can fully exhaust in a single dungeon run. The density of encounter-capable rooms relative to the depth of the dungeon creates a space that feels more populated than the surface areas. Despite having far less authored content, that feeling of density is a design achievement that goes mostly unacknowledged because it operates through a system players tend to approach instrumentally rather than experientially. The rotary levers used to progress between dungeon levels, the mechanisms you interact with to open the gate to the next floor, have a different activation animation from every other interactable object in the game. Most objects use a short reach and grip animation. The dungeon levers use a full-body push animation that takes approximately twice as long. That animation investment in a purely functional interaction suggests the level transitions were originally intended to be more significant moments than they became in the final design. Chapter 6. The Hunters Who Never Speak. Bloodborne's NPC hunter system is one of the game's most underexplored narrative dimensions. The hunters who appear as phantoms, as invaders, or as wandering figures in specific locations carry item sets, move sets, and positioning details that collectively suggest histories the game never directly narrates. The old hunter Henriette, who appears as a golden phantom in the Forbidden Woods near the entrance to Bergenworth, has a weapon loadout and set of items that do not match any faction currently active in the game. Her weapons suggest an affiliation with neither the workshop nor the healing church. She appears in the Forbidden Woods at a position that implies she was following or guarding the path to Bergenworth. She says nothing. She does not engage unless you approach her. The Golden Phantom status in the game typically indicates a friendly summon for a nearby boss fight, but Henriette does not correspond to any boss in that part of the game. The Bloody Crow of Canehurst is one of the most well-known hostile hunter encounters in the game, invading in a specific window of Alfred's questline. But what makes him an anomaly is not his mechanics but the timing of his appearance and the details of his gear. He wears partial Canehurst gear mixed with hunter gear, suggesting an affiliation that crosses factional lines. He invades specifically during the window, when Alfred is acting, which suggests awareness of Alfred's plans. Whether the Crow is working for Annalise, working against Alfred independently, or acting on his own motivations is never stated. The Hunter of Hunters Covenant, represented by Eileen the Crow, is an organization whose described function, hunting hunters who have lost themselves to blood, is not fully supported by the number of targets Eileen actually has in the game. She hunts two named targets: the Gascoigne Phantom location encounter and the Henrik fight in the Tomb of Eden. After completing her questline, she gives the player the Covenant badge and exits the narrative. But the Hunter of Hunters concept implies an ongoing operation with multiple active hunters. The scale of the concept relative to the scale of its implementation suggests either compression in the final design or a much larger intended questline. Henrik the Hunter, associated with Father Gascoigne's past, is one of the most narratively loaded characters in the game, given how little the game actually shows you about him. His gear, the Henrik's Hunter set, describes a hunter of significant experience and accomplishment. His position guarding the Tomb of Eden, which is where Gascoigne's daughter may go if you direct her there, implies a connection to Gascoigne's family that the game does not explain. Whether Henrik knew about the daughter, whether he was there to protect her, or because he is already lost to the hunt, is left entirely to implication. The Yharnam hunters who appear in the unseen village at night are distinctive because they fight as a group in ways that suggest coordination. They do not all rush the player simultaneously. They hold positions, flank, and apply pressure in a pattern that looks more like trained military behavior than the typical aggressive rush of lost hunters. The Yharnam area as a whole suggests a cult that was operating inside Yharnam, with its own hierarchy and its own version of the hunt. The hunters who serve that cult fight like people who are trained together for a specific kind of encounter. The Hunter set, the default gear the player starts in, has an item description that mentions it was designed for someone and implies a specific person, not a generic hunter archetype. The specific tailoring, the designed quality rather than mass-produced, suggests the set was made for an individual, and the player inhabiting it suggests the player character is either that individual or someone who was given that individual's gear. Which of those is true changes the entire framing of what the player character is and what their relationship to the hunt's history is. Simon the Harrowed, the DLC hunter who appears in the Hunter's Nightmare, is one of the game's most explicitly designed as someone who should not be in the nightmare but is. He is not a hunter of the standard kind. His weapon, the bowblade, is a compromise between hunter and civilian tool, a hunting weapon adapted for monster work. His reason for being in the nightmare is connected to Ludwig's history and the healing church, but the detail that he came to the nightmare voluntarily, seeking to end Ludwig out of a combination of grief and obligation, makes him one of the few characters in the game whose motivations are both clear and complex. The hunter NPC that appears in the unseen village, wandering the rooftops rather than the street level, is easy to miss because their patrol route takes them away from any obvious path through the area. They are wearing gear associated with the powder kegs, the workshop splinter group responsible for developing explosive and flamethrower weapons. A powder keg hunter wandering the Yharnam rooftops has no narrative explanation, no dialogue, and no quest connection. They are simply there, moving through a space that their faction has no documented reason to be in. The Hunter of the Old Workshop, the item description for the Old Hunter set, references a founding period of the workshop when Gehrman was not yet the mentor figure he later becomes, but was himself a student of an earlier tradition. The implication that there was a pre-Gehrman hunting tradition organized enough to train and equip hunters, but different enough from Gehrman's eventual methodology that the items had to be redesigned, suggests a history of the hunt that predates everything the game explicitly shows you. The Executioners, as a faction, present an anomaly in the game's faction design. They are described as exterminators of the vile blood, followers of Ligarius, and opponents of the healing church's accommodation of the arcane. But in practice, the only living executioners in the game are Alfred and the armed executioner enemies in Forsaken Canehurst Castle. Alfred is the last of them, yet the Canehurst Castle is populated with executioner armoured enemies. Either those enemies are not truly executioners, or Alfred's claim to be the last is incorrect. The Powder Keg's origin story, told through item descriptions rather than any NPC, involves a violent schism from the main workshop over a disagreement about acceptable methods. Jura, the old hunter you encounter in Old Yharnam, who uses a Gatling gun, is either the last surviving powder keg or at minimum the faction's most prominent visible member. But Jura's behavior, his protection of the beasts in Old Yharnam rather than their extermination, represents such a departure from any hunting faction's stated purpose that it raises the question of whether Jura is still operating within any framework of the hunt at all. The Choir, as a hunting-adjacent faction, operates in a space between the Healing Church's institutional functions and the Research Hall's experimental work. The Choir are described as Healing Church elites who have achieved direct communion with the stars, with the cosmos, but their physical presence in the game, as enemies in Iosefka's clinic and in the Nightmare, shows them as transformed rather than enlightened. The gap between how the Choir describes itself and what the Choir appears to actually be is one of the game's most pointed institutional critiques. The men outside Iosefka's clinic, who appear at different points in the game and comment on the player's visits, are never given names and never given gear that would place them within any faction. They are ordinary people trying to reach the clinic and being turned away. One of them, if you follow his thread across multiple visits, is eventually not present, replaced by a note, or simply gone. The game does not tell you what happened to him. The NPC, known as the Afflicted Beggar, who appears in the Forbidden Woods asking for beast blood pellets, is transformed into an abhorrent beast if given multiple pellets over time. The implication is explicit. He is consuming the pellets to become something. But the character design choices around the beggar, the way he is coded as pitiable before the transformation, the choice to make the player an agent of his transformation suggests a moral dimension to the encounter that goes further than the typical NPC turns hostile pattern. You did not turn him into a beast by accident. You fed him. The game does not comment on this afterward. Adela the Nun has one of the most specific behavioral triggers in any NPC questline in the game. Her turn to hostile behavior is conditional on how much blood you have taken from other NPC sources, specifically Ariana. Adela's violence is driven by a specific kind of jealousy that is law-linked to the Church's teachings about the purity of bloodlines. The precision of her trigger conditions implies a level of design investment in a character who can be entirely missed if the player does not interact with her in the right sequence. That investment in a missable character is consistent with the game's general approach to narrative, where important information and meaningful moments are not guaranteed to be seen. The NPC imposter, Iosefka, when you are able to reach her before she has fully consolidated her hold on the clinic, has dialogue that does not entirely match the agenda her actions suggest. She speaks like someone performing a role she has been assigned. The specificity of her language, particularly the way she uses the Healing Church's formal register while describing her own transformation research, suggests either a very deep commitment to institutional cover or a character whose motivations are more complex than simple ambition. The ambiguity is never resolved. The two hunters who appear in the upper cathedral ward, accessible after collecting the key from Yahargul, are the only hostile hunters in that area who are not members of any documented faction. Their gear is a mixture that suggests either improvised equipment or a faction whose wardrobe has not been catalogued. They patrol separately and do not behave as coordinated partners, whether they are guards assigned to the upper cathedral ward, explorers who arrived independently, or hunters who followed a lead that brought them there and have since been driven mad, is not addressed. Patches the Spider, an NPC who appears in the DLC, is one of the most tonally distinctive characters in the game. His voice performance, his dialogue, and his merchant function are distinct from every other NPC in Bloodborne's world. He is functional, self-interested, and unbothered by the cosmic horror surrounding him in a way that no other character manages. The contrast between his register and the game's general tone is sharp enough to feel like a deliberate design choice. He exists as a reminder that the world had people in it who were not consumed by the hunt or the blood or the great ones, people who were simply trying to conduct their business and get by. That the game chose to embody that reminder in a spider hybrid creature is Bloodborne being Bloodborne. The constable's garb and its associated constable NPC who is already being transformed into a beast by the time you find the set, suggests a law enforcement structure in Yharnam that predates or runs parallel to the Healing Church's authority. A constable, in most institutional frameworks, represents civil rather than religious authority. That Yharnam had a civil authority before the Church's dominance, and that this authority had its own dress and function, implies a political history the game does not explore. The NPC, in the small window near the beginning of Central Yharnam, who speaks to the player from behind a closed shutter, is one of the game's most efficiently tragic background characters. He describes the night's events from his limited perspective, tells you not to go out, and over the course of the game, gradually stops responding. The arc of his disappearance from the window, from active speaker to silence, is a small story told entirely in ambient terms. No quest line, no named item drop, just a voice that eventually stops. The Paarl fight's connection to any larger story is one of the more frustrating gaps in the game's NPC lore, because Paarl is visually and mechanically one of the most distinctive enemies in the game, and yet nothing in the game explains who or what she was. The dungeon she is found in is clearly a holding area. Someone put her there. The item she drops does not explain her. The connection her fight has to an alternate path to the Healing Church workshop suggests the designers thought her placement was narratively important. But the narrative is not there. The wandering madmen who appear in the nightmare sections, wearing the madmen set, are enemies that move and attack in ways that suggest they retain some fighting skill, despite their apparent mental state. The madman set description talks about those who have gazed into the abyss too long, implying these were once trained individuals, hunters or scholars, who lost their minds to knowledge. The fighting competence, surviving the madness, is either a character design detail or a gameplay necessity. But either way, it says something about what the madness takes and what it leaves. The church doctor NPC encountered in Central Yharnam during the early game, who tells the player to look for the Healing Church for sanctuary, is one of the only characters in the game who explicitly directs you toward the church's authority as something trustworthy. His function is as a tutorial-adjacent pointer, but his framing positions the church as a legitimate institution in a game that systematically dismantles that legitimacy. His certainty, at the start of the game, stands in maximum contrast to what the game reveals about the church by the end. Whether that contrast was designed or is an artifact of the tutorial context is something only the development team knows. The final NPC worth discussing in this chapter is Gehrman himself, not as a boss, but as a presence throughout the hunter's dream. His wheelchair, his tools, his relationship to the doll, his clipped and formal manner of speech, all of it builds a portrait of someone who has been in the same place for a very long time and has used the trappings of workshop routine to maintain the appearance of purpose. The detail that breaks the portrait is the flowers. He tends the flowers in the hunter's dream. That is the only activity he performs that is not functional. In a game where every lore detail is intentional, a character who tends flowers is being given the one action in his environment that is purely about caring for something that will continue to live. That is not an accident. Chapter 7. The Eyes That Watch From Below. This chapter is about insight, what the game implies it is, what having it changes, and the specific anomalies associated with entities that are described as perceiving or granting it. The insight mechanic is one of Bloodborne's most interesting systemic ideas, and also one of the most incompletely realized, in the sense that the game gestures at a world that responds to how much you know, without fully building out that world at every level. The base mechanic is that insight is gained by finding and interacting with certain things, using Madman's knowledge items, discovering bosses, and completing certain events. You spend insight at the Insight Bath messengers for items. The cost of knowledge is thus framed as a resource that can be depleted through commerce. That is a deeply strange economic metaphor for what insight represents in the lore. The messengers are the game's most quietly omnipresent entities. They appear everywhere, not just at lamps but at item pickup locations, at fogwall gates, apparently wherever the player goes. They communicate through gestures and through the notes they carry. And the notes they carry are written by other hunters, both living Undead, the messengers as an information relay system connecting all hunters across time and nightmare simultaneously, is a function that the game establishes through the multiplayer mechanic, but does not fully develop as a lore element. The Moon Presence, the final boss of the base game's true ending, is the entity that is implied to be responsible for the hunter's dream. It calls itself to the player through the consumption of umbilical cords. Its design, the translucent white body, the radial arrangement of limbs, the complete silence during the fight, communicates something that most Great One designs do not, which is a kind of fragility. The Moon Presence does not seem powerful when you see it. It seems like something that has been waiting for a very long time and is no longer certain of its own endurance. The implication in most readings is that the Moon Presence manipulates the hunt, specifically Gehrman's perpetual service as Master of the Dream, as a way of farming insight or harvesting something analogous to it from the hunters who cycle through. The Dream, as a mechanism of production rather than salvation, is the game's darkest institutional reading, and the Moon Presence as its operator ties back to a pattern established across the game of organizations and entities that present themselves as helpers while operating on a different agenda. Gehrman's dialogue, particularly in the false ending where you accept his release, is one of the more carefully constructed pieces of writing in the game. The way he speaks about the hunt, with something that is not quite grief and not quite acceptance, suggests a person who has been operating in the dream for so long that the question of whether it is good or bad has ceased to mean anything to him. He simply is the master of the dream, the same way the brain of Mensis simply is the brain. There is no longer a person inside the function. The One Reborn is a boss in Yharnam, whose design, a massive pile of human bodies fused together, raises the question of what the choir servants and bell maidens surrounding it are doing. They are not guards, they are participants. They are ringing bells that empower the creature while it fights. The One Reborn is a collaborative entity in a way that no other boss in the game is. It requires others to maintain its power. What that suggests about how it was created, whether it requires the continuous involvement of its attendants to function, is a question the fight design implies, without the lore explicitly stating. The Great Ones are consistently presented as beyond human comprehension, but specific Great Ones have specific relationships with humans that are more concrete than the abstract cosmic horror framing would suggest. Ebrietas was left behind by the other Great Ones. Murgo is the child of a human queen and a Great One. Kos received the prayers of the Hamlet fishermen and gave them something in return. These are relationships, not observations from a distance. The Great Ones who have these relationships appear consistently different from the ones who do not. Less abstract, more present, and in some cases more damaged. The umbilical cord items, each with its own specific origin, collectively imply that Great One reproduction has occurred multiple times in human history, always with traumatic consequences for the human involved, and that the product of those unions is something the human world both fears and seeks. The 3 cords you collect represent 3 distinct encounters between the human and the cosmic. Their combination is a trigger for transformation, without the game fully explaining why consuming the echoes of these births produces a specific outcome of the childhood's beginning ending. The celestial emissary boss, found in the upper cathedral ward, is thematically one of the game's most interesting Great One encounters. It is a creature that presents as small, weak, and almost unthreatening until the phase transition reveals its true form beneath a pile of identical smaller versions of itself. The mass of smaller emissaries that surrounds the true form during the fight is visually communicating something about collective consciousness and individual emergence that several of the game's other Great One designs approach from different angles. The brain of Mensis, discussed in earlier chapters, is worth returning to in the context of insight specifically. Looking at the brain costs you nothing but your sanity. Using the lever to drop it into the pit removes its visual presence, but not its effect. Even in the pit, invisible, the brain continues to influence the area. What this suggests about what the brain is, and whether visual obscuration of it accomplishes anything meaningful, is one of the game's small but consistent arguments about the relationship between knowledge and the concealment of its sources. The amygdalas exist throughout Yharnam, but are only visible to hunters with sufficient insight. The implication is that they have always been there, and that human perception, unaugmented by insight, simply cannot register them. What they are doing when they are not being perceived, whether they behave differently, whether the game's architecture accommodates their presence in ways players do not notice, because they are focused on the enemies they can see, is a detail that the game hints at through the placement of amygdala-shaped scorch marks and residue in Cathedral Ward, even below the insight threshold. The Bath Messengers sell certain items only above or below specific insight thresholds. Kaufman sells certain items only after specific story events. Gehrman's stock does not change. These differential availabilities imply that the hunter's dream is not a neutral space, but one that responds to your state. The dream knows what you know. That is either a property of the dream as designed, which ties back to the moon presence as its architect, or a property of the messengers as an information network, which raises questions about what they're doing with the information they collect from every hunter who passes through. The doll speaks about the hunter's experience, with a specificity that suggests she knows things about the hunter that have not been communicated to her directly. She references your emotions, your state of being, your relationship to the hunt, in ways that should not be available to her through normal observation. Whether this is a narrative convenience, a quirk of her construction, or evidence that she is connected to the messenger's network in a way the game does not make explicit, is an ambiguity that her dialogue sustains without resolving. The madman's knowledge and great one's wisdom items, which grant insight when consumed, are described as things found in the nightmare spaces and carried back.